Here, a room is ready.
Thank you.
Thank you, miss. Thank you.
By the time Nathaniel Ashbourne reached the Fourth Inn in Belford, the rain had soaked through his old military coat. His boots were heavy with mud, and the few coins left in his pocket mattered more than the title he had deliberately left behind. The innkeeper took one look at the worn uniform and the small leather bag in Nathaniel's hand before asking whether he could pay. Nathaniel placed his remaining coins on the counter and explained that they were enough for either supper or a bed, but not both. The man barely considered the money before pushing it back and telling him to try somewhere cheaper. Nathaniel stepped into the rain without arguing. He had slept in frozen fields, marched on empty stomachs, and spent nights listening to artillery beyond dark hills. So the prospect of missing one comfortable bed should not have troubled him. What unsettled him was something different. 3 doors had now closed. Because everyone looking at him saw the same thing, a discharged soldier with worn clothes and too little money to be worth the risk. Months earlier, those same clothes had carried him through the final days of war. Now they concealed the fact that Nathaniel was Duke of Ashbourne. He had chosen to travel without his carriage, servants, or family crest because there was one duty he wanted to perform without ceremony. In his bag lay a sealed letter and an old silver watch belonging to Thomas Hale, a fellow soldier who had died before he could return home. Nathaniel had promised to deliver both to Thomas's mother, who lived somewhere beyond Belford. Sending a servant in his place never felt right to him. For this journey, he used only one name, Nathan Gray. The Lantern Inn was his last try before he resigned himself to sleeping in a stable. Warm light spilled through the windows, and inside, the common room was nearly full of travelers escaping the storm. Behind the counter stood an older innkeeper, while a woman around 30 moved between the tables, carrying bowls of stew with the quick confidence of someone familiar with every corner of the building and every problem likely to arise inside it. The older man shook his head before Nathaniel even finished asking about a room. "We have one left, and I'm not giving it away to someone who can't pay." "How much do you have?" Her father frowned. Eleanor ignored the warning. Nathaniel showed her the coins. Eleanor counted them once before looking back at him. "That will buy supper or the room. So everyone keeps reminding me. Have you eaten since morning?" When Nathaniel admitted he hadn't, Eleanor reached beneath the counter and placed a small brass key in front of him. "Then buy supper." Nathaniel looked at the key. "And the room? You can owe me for that." Her father muttered something about running a business rather than a charity, but Eleanor just carried another bowl to a waiting table. Nathaniel picked up the key only after she returned. "You know nothing about me." "I know what rain looks like." That seemed to satisfy her. The room upstairs was small, with a narrow bed beneath the sloping roof and barely enough space for a chair. Nathaniel slept better than expected, only to find the next morning that Eleanor had given him her own room and had spent the night in a cramped chamber beside the kitchen. When he protested, she continued arranging breakfast plates as if the matter hardly deserved discussion. "You were soaked through. I was not. I could have slept near the fire. You would have frightened the guests." Nathaniel raised an eyebrow. "Do I seem that dangerous?" Eleanor glanced toward the yard where the firewood he had tried to split that morning lay in several embarrassingly uneven pieces. "After watching you with an axe, not particularly." For the first time in days, Nathaniel laughed. By noon, heavy rain had damaged the bridge leading out of Belford, and travelers were told it might take several days before carts and horses could safely cross again. Nathaniel therefore stayed at the Lantern Inn and insisted on working for his lodging. He carried barrels, repaired a loose hinge, moved luggage, and discovered that Eleanor was perfectly willing to give orders to a former soldier twice her size when she thought he was being inefficient. It was late that afternoon when raised voices outside interrupted them. An older veteran stood across the street, arguing with another lodging house owner. One arm moved stiffly from an old injury, and his coat had been repaired so many times that little of the original fabric remained. The few coins in his hand were clearly insufficient. "I have pension money coming from York," the veteran said. "I only need 2 nights." The landlord refused and pointed toward a local official standing nearby. The official produced a printed notice explaining that travelers without confirmed employment or sufficient funds could be refused accommodation under regulations intended to discourage vagrancy. Nathaniel crossed the road before he had fully decided to interfere. "The man served," he said. Nathaniel took the notice and read it. The wording was familiar. Months earlier, while still overseas, he had signed a collection of estate recommendations intended to reduce disorder and control the growing number of unemployed travelers moving through Ashbourne lands. Nathaniel looked toward the bottom of the document. The Ashbourne seal appeared beneath the authorization. His seal. Who approved this? He asked, although he already knew. The Duke of Ashbourne. Nathaniel handed the paper back slowly. That evening, Eleanor gave the veteran supper and found him work around the stable in exchange for a place to sleep. Nathaniel watched without mentioning that the regulation which had almost left the man outside carried his own authority. Later, when the common room had emptied, Eleanor found Nathaniel sitting near the kitchen fire with the notice beside him and Thomas Hale's silver watch in his hand. "You have looked miserable since this afternoon," she said. "Did the Duke personally offend you somehow?" Nathaniel gave a humorless chuckle. "Perhaps he deserves to be offended." Eleanor sat opposite him. "His Grace probably receives reports filled with numbers and signatures. Men who own places like this often know what happens on paper without knowing what happens to the people underneath it." Nathaniel looked at her. She had no idea whom she was criticizing. Her attention shifted to the watch in his hand. "Is that why you came this way?" He closed his fingers around it. "I promised a man I would bring something home." Eleanor studied him briefly, then chose not to ask for more. After a moment, Nathaniel said, "When the bridge is repaired, I am going toward Ashbourne. Then perhaps you will meet our illustrious Duke. You dislike him?" Eleanor considered the question before shaking her head. "I would have to know him first." She rose to collect the empty cups, then paused beside the table. "A man can own a great deal of land without ever knowing the people standing on it." Nathaniel watched her disappear into the kitchen. Then he lowered his eyes to the regulation bearing the Ashbourne seal. For years, he had believed distance excused what he could not see. Belford was beginning to teach him otherwise. The bridge remained closed for another 2 days, but by then Nathaniel had stopped pretending that the damaged road was the only reason he had not left Belford. He still needed to find Thomas Hale's mother, and when Eleanor heard the name, she immediately recognized it. "Mrs. Hale lives beyond the western fields near the old stone chapel," she said while pouring tea into 2 chipped cups. Thomas was her only son. Nathaniel's hand tightened slightly around the cup. "You knew him?" Everyone in Belford knew him. He was the sort of man who could repair a gate, calm a frightened horse, and somehow still arrive late for church every Sunday. The affection in Eleanor's voice made Thomas suddenly feel less like a memory from a battlefield, and more like the man he had been before the uniform. Nathaniel had known Thomas as a soldier who complained about army boots, carried dried apples in his pocket, and spoke often of a mother who worried too much. Eleanor offered to show him the way. They walked there the following morning beneath a pale sky, following a narrow road between damp fields until they reached a modest cottage surrounded by bare fruit trees. Nathaniel slowed as they approached, and Eleanor noticed that the man, who had faced armed enemies without hesitation, now seemed almost reluctant to lift his hand and knock. Mrs. Hale opened the door herself. She was small, silver-haired, and older than Nathaniel expected. The moment he gave Thomas's name, her expression changed, though she did not cry. "He asked me to bring this back to you, Mrs." Hale stared at the watch for a long moment before looking up. "Were you with him?" "Yes." Her fingers closed around the metal. "Was he afraid?" He could have said Thomas had been fearless, smiling, peaceful, everything families wanted to imagine about the final moments of the men they loved. Instead, he told her the truth. "Yes, we all were, Mrs." Hale's eyes filled, but Nathaniel continued gently. "He stayed with the men beside him. He was frightened, but he did not leave them. The last thing he asked was that I make certain this reached you." He handed her the sealed letter. Mrs. Hale pressed it against her chest and whispered, "Thank you for bringing my boy home." The word struck harder than Nathaniel expected. Thomas had not come home. Not really. Hail a little longer, and when Nathaniel finally emerged, she did not offer sympathy that would force him to answer. She simply walked beside him until the cottage disappeared behind the trees. After several minutes, she said, "You cared about him. He was under my command." Eleanor glanced toward him. "That was not what I said." Nathaniel looked ahead. "No, it wasn't." Something changed between them during the walk back to Belford. Perhaps it was because Eleanor had seen grief in him without trying to make it smaller. Or because Nathaniel had finally spoken about Thomas somewhere that did not smell of gunpowder and mud. Whatever the reason, the guarded politeness between them began to soften. That evening, after the last customers had gone, they sat near the kitchen fire while Eleanor counted receipts. And Nathaniel repaired a loose leather strap on one of the luggage trunks. She told him about her older brother Samuel, who had returned from military service with a damaged leg and almost no money. 3 inns had refused him on the journey home, and after one freezing night in a barn, he arrived in Belford feverish. And barely able to walk. "He recovered," Eleanor said, "but I never forgot the way people applauded those men when they marched away. And then became uncomfortable when they returned poor, injured, or unable to find work." Nathaniel thought again of the regulation bearing his seal. "How many soldiers do you let stay here without payment?" "Not many. Enough." "And your father allows this?" "My father complains about it." From the next Hart's voice, "I can hear you." Eleanor smiled. Nathaniel did too. Those quiet evenings became the part of Belford he began to anticipate most. Eleanor asked him questions no one at Ashbourne Hall ever asked because everyone there already believed they knew what a duke should want. She wanted to know whether he had enjoyed military life, what country he would visit if no duty required it, and what he intended to do now that the war was over. Nathaniel found the last question unexpectedly difficult. "I suppose I will return to the life waiting for me." That sounds suspiciously like something you must do rather than something you want. He looked at her. "What would you have me do?" "I did not ask what I would have you do." Nathaniel laughed softly. "You are inconveniently precise. I run an inn. Precision prevents people from leaving without paying." Later, he turned the question on her and asked why she had never married. Eleanor continued folding a cloth for several seconds before answering, "There. He wanted me to sell the inn and move to Bristol." "You did not love him?" "I might have eventually, but he had already decided what my life would look like before he asked whether I wanted it." Nathaniel waited. Eleanor looked directly at him. "I did not refuse marriage. I refused disappearing inside one." The words stayed with him long after she went upstairs. By then, Eleanor had also begun noticing things about Nathan Gray that did not fit the man he claimed to be. He read newspapers as though accustomed to political reports, understood estate management better than most officers she had met, and possessed table manners that seemed absurdly polished for a penniless soldier. One evening, after watching him instinctively correct the placement of 3 forks before sitting down, Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "Either the army has become remarkably particular about dining etiquette, or you are not telling me everything." Nathaniel felt the truth rise dangerously close. For several seconds, he almost gave her his real name. Then he imagined what would happen afterward. The easy teasing would disappear. She would begin calling him Your Grace, and every conversation would suddenly contain the title he had spent these few precious days without. So he smiled instead. "Perhaps the army is full of surprises. Whatever you're hiding, Nathan, make sure it's because it truly belongs to you. Not because you think I'm too foolish to understand." He should have told her then. He knew that later. The next morning, the sound of several horses thundered into the yard before breakfast was over. Nathaniel rose from his chair as riders in Ashbourne's dark colors came into view. Eleanor stepped toward the window. "Friends of yours?" Nathaniel did not respond. The lead officer dismounted, crossed the yard quickly, and entered the inn with visible relief. His eyes found Nathaniel immediately. Then, before Eleanor, her father, and every traveler in the common room, he bowed. "Your Grace, we've been searching everywhere for you." Silence spread through the Lantern Inn. Eleanor slowly turned toward Nathaniel. The man she had fed, sheltered, teased, and trusted stood exactly where Nathan Gray had stood a moment before. Only Nathan Gray had never existed. And for the first time since Belford, Nathaniel had no idea what to say. For several seconds after the officer bowed, no one in the lantern inn moved. Nathaniel had faced cannon fire with less discomfort than the silence that followed. Eleanor stood beside the window, one hand still resting against the curtain she had pulled aside when the horses arrived. Her expression was not dramatic or furious. She simply looked at him with the stillness of someone rearranging every conversation of the past week in her mind. And discovering that each one now meant something different. The officer glanced between them, finally sensing that he had walked into something more complicated than a missing duke. "Your Grace, Ashbourne Hall has been on your trail, searching for you since your escort was lost near York." "We feared." "I am quite well," Nathaniel interrupted. "Give me a moment." The officer bowed again and withdrew. Eleanor waited until the door closed behind him. "Your Grace." Nathaniel stepped toward her. "Eleanor, I can explain." "I imagine you can." Her father stared at Nathaniel as if he had suddenly discovered royalty sleeping in his attic. Around them, the remaining guests had become very interested in their breakfasts without actually eating anything. Nathaniel lowered his voice. "Not here." Eleanor considered him for a moment, then walked toward the kitchen. He explained that Nathan Gray had not been a character invented to test anyone's kindness. He had served in the army. Thomas Hale had truly been under his command. And the promise to return the watch and letter had been real. Or a title that would turn Thomas's final request into another formal duty performed by the Duke of Ashbourne. Eleanor listened without interrupting. Nathaniel continued, "I never expected the bridge to fail or to remain here long enough for any of this to happen." "Any of what?" He hesitated. Her eyes hardened slightly. "That is precisely the problem, Nathaniel. You keep deciding which truth I am allowed to hear." He had no answer to that. Eleanor looked away, struggling more with the memory of every moment he let her speak freely than with his title. She knew she would have acted differently if she knew who was sitting across from her. "I complained about the Duke of Ashbourne right to your face. You told the truth. I showed you a regulation with your own seal on it, while you pretended not to know who signed it. I was ashamed. That doesn't make the deception any smaller." Nathaniel took a slow breath. "No. It doesn't." The fact that he didn't defend himself seemed to unsettle her more than an argument might have. After a moment, he reached into his coat and placed several coins on the table. "For the room. The meals. Everything I owe." Eleanor looked at the money and pushed it back toward him. "I gave a room to Nathan Gray." Nathaniel's expression tightened. "I am still the same." "Then why were you so afraid to give me his real name?" That question remained unanswered when Eleanor left the kitchen. Nathaniel returned to Ashbourne Hall that afternoon. The difference between Belford and the estate struck him before the carriage even reached the main doors. At the hall, servants hurried to receive him, and the steward apologized for every inconvenience. And correspondence had already been arranged in neat piles on his desk. Here, no one would ever ask whether he could afford supper before offering him a bed. For years, Nathaniel had mistaken efficiency for understanding. He no longer did. The first document he requested was the regulation he had seen in Belford. His steward, Mr. Carstairs, produced the relevant papers and explained that the rules were designed to control vagrancy, protect innkeepers from unpaid debts, and reduce disorder in market towns. "You approved the recommendations yourself, Your Grace." Nathaniel looked at his signature. "I know." Carstairs appeared relieved, believing the matter settled. "Then you understand that local officials have simply carried out your instructions." Nathaniel lifted his eyes. "No. I understand that I signed words whose consequences I never bothered to see." Carstairs frowned. "No landowner can personally inspect every application of every regulation. Then perhaps no landowner should sign one he does not understand." The steward fell silent. Nathaniel ordered the policy suspended immediately, but he knew cancelling one document would solve very little. The veteran outside the Belford lodging house had not been rejected because of a single cruel man. He had been rejected because an entire system made it convenient to treat poverty as evidence of bad character. So Nathaniel began asking questions. He summoned former soldiers living on Ashbourne land, innkeepers from several villages, parish officers, tradesmen, and families waiting months for military pensions. For the first few meetings, almost everyone told him what they thought a duke wanted to hear. Only after Nathaniel stopped sitting behind his desk and began asking what happened when pensions were delayed. When employers turned away injured men or when a soldier arrived after dark with no money, the answers became less comfortable. Some men slept in barns. Others walked through the night. A few avoided towns entirely because they feared being detained as vagrants. Nathaniel heard Eleanor's voice each time. People applauded soldiers when they marched away and then became uncomfortable when they returned poor, injured, or unable to find work. He could not change that attitude with a proclamation, but he could change what happened on Ashbourne land. Working with several former soldiers and cooperative innkeepers, he drafted a simple system. Veterans who could prove recent military service would not be denied one night of food and shelter merely because they lacked immediate payment. Participating inns would be reimbursed through an estate fund, while men who wished to work for part of the cost could do so without being treated as beggars. Nathaniel read the proposal 3 times. Then he realized he was making the same mistake again. He was designing something for people whose lives he had only recently begun to understand. So he sent a copy to Belford. Not with flowers. Not with money. Not with an apology disguised as a gift. Only a note addressed to Eleanor. You understood this problem before I knew it existed. What have I missed? For nearly 2 weeks, no answer came. Nathaniel told himself that he had asked a question, not purchased a reply, and therefore had no right to impatience. On the 15th morning, a package arrived from the Lantern Inn. She had corrected reimbursement limits, suggested that veterans without formal discharge papers be allowed confirmation from commanding officers or parish officials, and crossed out a paragraph she considered unnecessarily complicated. Nathaniel read every note. At the bottom of the final page, she had added one last sentence: "You forgot the horses. A soldier may sleep indoors while his horse freezes outside." Nathaniel stared at it for several seconds. Then, for the first time since leaving Belford, he laughed. Eleanor had not forgiven him. But she had answered. For now, that was more than he had earned. Nathaniel returned to Belford several weeks later, but this time there was no military coat, no borrowed name, and no attempt to arrive unnoticed. He came alone. The Lantern Inn looked exactly as he remembered it, the same hanging sign moving gently in the wind. The same narrow windows, the same warm light beyond the glass. For a moment, Nathaniel stood outside longer than necessary, aware that the last time he had crossed that threshold, Eleanor had believed he was a penniless soldier with nowhere else to go. Now she knew exactly who he was. He knocked anyway. Eleanor opened the door herself. For a second, neither spoke. Then Nathaniel said, "I am not here to ask for a free room." Her expression softened despite herself. "Good. Your credit was becoming concerning." The laugh that escaped him surprised them both, and some of the tension. Nathaniel didn't ask for forgiveness that evening. Instead, he showed Eleanor the revised veteran lodging plan, including every correction she had sent back. The horses were included. "So you listened," she said. "I am trying to make a habit of it." That became the beginning of something new between them. Nathaniel returned to Belford regularly over the following months, sometimes to meet innkeepers participating in the program, sometimes to speak with. And occasionally for no reason he was willing to admit beyond wanting dinner at. He sat with farmers, listened to complaints about roads and rents, and learned that people spoke very differently to a duke once they believed he genuinely wanted the inconvenient answer. Eleanor watched the change carefully. She refused to be impressed by speeches. What mattered was that Nathaniel kept returning, even when she was not warm toward him. That he corrected policies nobody outside Belford would ever know about. And that he began visiting villages he had previously known only as names beneath columns of numbers. One evening she said, "You know, becoming a better duke does not automatically make you an honest man." Nathaniel nodded. "I know. And Nathan Gray still bothers me. He bothers me too." That earned the faintest smile. Nathaniel looked toward the fire before continuing. Nathan Gray was not a lie about what I had lived through. But he became a lie when I let you trust a name I knew I would eventually take away. Eleanor studied him for a moment. Then perhaps Nathaniel Ashbourne should learn something from him. What? He knew how to sit in a kitchen without believing the room belonged to him. Nathaniel smiled. I can work on that. By winter, the new lodging system was operating across several Ashbourne villages. Fewer veterans were turned away, and participating inns were reimbursed quickly. Men waiting for delayed pensions could stay without being treated as criminals simply because their pockets were empty. Nathaniel asked Eleanor to help supervise the program. She agreed on one condition. The lantern inn remains mine. I would not dare argue. Nearly a year after the night they first met, another storm rolled across Belford. Rain struck the windows just as heavily as it had before, and Nathaniel arrived at the inn with water running from his coat. Eleanor looked up from the counter. You could have waited until morning. Could have. He placed a coin on the wood between them. 1 room. Eleanor glanced at the coin. For how long? Nathaniel hesitated, then smiled. That depends. On what? Eleanor understood immediately what he was about to ask, but she raised one hand before he could continue. The first night you came here, I gave you a room because I believed you had nowhere else to go. Nathaniel listened. If you stay now, I need to know it is because this is where you want to be. Not because you feel you owe me something. He stepped closer but not enough to crowd her. It is the first place where I was welcomed before anyone knew what I owned. Eleanor's expression changed. Nathaniel continued more quietly, and it is the first place that taught me what I was responsible for. Only then did he ask her to marry him. Eleanor let him wait long enough to make him nervous. Then she said yes. Their marriage did not close the Lantern Inn. Eleanor continued helping run it and remained involved in the veteran program. While Nathaniel divided his time between Ashbourne Hall and the villages he had once governed from a distance. He still read reports. He simply no longer mistook them for people. Months later, on another wet evening, a young former soldier entered the Lantern Inn carrying a battered pack. His uniform was worn, and his expression embarrassed as he admitted he did not have enough money for both supper and a bed. Nathaniel, standing near the stairs, recognized the words immediately. Eleanor looked at him. He looked back at her. Then she turned toward the young man. Feed him first. Nathaniel reached behind the counter, took down a brass key, and placed it in front of the soldier. We can discuss the bill tomorrow. The young man stared at them, unable to understand why a stranger's door had opened so easily. Nathaniel did. His journey had begun with Thomas Hale, a promise that needed carrying home. And a night when almost every door in Belford had closed in his face. It ended with one more door remaining open.